All right, so tonight we're going to start working with the new form workspace. Now, so far we've been working in solid space, and what that means is we've been doing the sketches, things like that, extruding them straight up or as an XZ plane, and revolving or lofting, stuff like that. They've all been solids based on sketches and such, based on defined lines. Tonight we're going to start working with the form workspace, which is essentially Fusion's sculpting workspace. So it's going to be much more organic. Now, Fusion is not a true sculpting software. If you want to do things like sculpting like minifigures, things like that, there are far better programs for that because they are actually dedicated to that. Things like Blender, which is a free program, I highly recommend it for that. Under the Autodesk family, Maya, you have access to Maya with your student account. You can download that, play with that. Remember, you have access to this account through the entirety of your time here at Bridgewater. As long as you have a student account, or you can prove you have one, you'll still have access to that account. All right. But what the difference is mainly in how objects are created. And so, excuse me, like I said, so far they've been based on a plane, sketch, extrude, revolve, yada, 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 punch holes in it, make twists. Maybe you can emboss, deboss, things like that. A little bit of round objects, spheres, cylinders, that sort. We are going to be working with the modeling workspace that automatically creates rounded things. You can still very much create angular creased objects and such, but it's a different way of working entirely. How this works is through T-Spline modeling. And T-splines are basically cleverly discussed as, or described as, it's where edges meet a vertex, which is a cross point. So it forms a T when it comes to an edge. Very clever, I know. Now, the difference is, think of this in terms of if you have like a net or a sheet like of cloth. Ideally, a sheet of paper, something like that, for just the surface, which is exactly what it is. You can bend that. Yeah, you can make folds in it, sharp creases, but a sheet, you are always limited to, it's not really going to stretch or anything. This, you can grab a point and pull that point back and forth and such. Basically, like a sheet of, or like a sheet, like cloth sheet, or if you have a fishing net, or if you want to get into physics, the whole like space-time thing where you see imagine the universe, or imagine some empty space as a sheet. You put a weight on it, gravity well forms, and it all drips down. Sure, yada yada yada. We're not going to get into astrophysics tonight. But what I mean by that is, if I grab one of these points, one of these vertices, all of these other things, these edges, are all going to follow with. So everything is connected, but you can move them pretty individually. There are sliders to allow for how much impact this has, as in, if I pulled one point, is that going to pull just that point straight up? Or I can expand the effect of, or the area of effect, and it will instead start to pull the whole sheet a lot more. But ultimately, the vocabulary for this is going to be, this entire plane can be a plane, but the space between these is a face. The lines, just like before, are edges, and the points that connect are vertices. Just a plural for a vertex. That is how we're going to describe things. That is how we're going to manipulate things, and that's how we're going to modify things. Now, we're not leaving everything. This is not a forget everything you've known. No, no. A lot of that stuff is absolutely still applicable. You can still extrude. You can still sketch even. You can still do all those kind of things. It's just a completely different way of working with those same tools. And I said this course progressively builds on simple tools, adds more, adds more. Now we have the ability to freeform work with everything. So the main thing is, keep this in mind, this whole sheet of cloth, this whole fishing net kind of idea. You can push, pull, but that also means you can grab a handful of vertices and drag them up and down, or you can grab by the face and bring the whole face up and down, move it around, twist, rotate, all that kind of thing. Obviously, if you grab a single point and you rotate it, that really is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. But if you grab multiples, now you have the ability to turn those. And all of these curves between are basically like points on an S point or on a fit point spline. So you can modify how these angle and all that kind of stuff. So that's really the basic terminology, the basic mindset for this kind of stuff. So let's hop over to Fusion, and I'll show you what we're working with here. All right, so free workspace. We are still working in the solid workspace. We're not changing to surface or mesh or anything like that. We're staying in the solid workspace. But this little pink gumball form here, this is the create form. So enters the form workspace. So just like when you like start a sketch, it changes all your tools around to just sketch tools. Same thing happens. We hit form edit, or we hit create form, just changes all the tools to more form based. And you can see here, form mode, you have the ability to create and edit history free bodies and such. Now what that means is, like sketching versus modifying sketches and such, history does not get applied to this. So once you enter the form workspace, just like with the sketch workspace, you're not creating history markers. So everything that happens in that either gets completed in one session, or you go back and edit it, but you'll have to use like Control or Command Y and Z to move back and forth through changes. Otherwise, it's essentially permanent or historyless. Meaning, if you go back into edit form, you'll have to manually edit it again. And just like with a sketch workspace, to finish, you just hit finish space. All right, so let's hit that. Look at some of our tools. All right, seems a lot more simple, and there are. You have your basic shapes. You can create sketches, but for now, we are going to work with basic shapes. You can create boxes, which do not start as a rectangular angle box. You're creating more of a pillow-like shape. And that's just because it's rounded a bit. But you can still create with faces, edges, all that sort of thing. You can subdivide it. Now, the main thing to keep in mind with this kind of stuff, do not make your object super complicated from the get-go. Keep things simple and then add complexity where needed. I'll explain what I mean in a moment. We can create boxes. You have your cylinders, your basic shapes. Now, a cylinder in this case does not create a solid thing. It's a form, meaning that it's basically just a straw, and then you close the ends off however you like. There's quad ball. Why are there two different spheres? There's quad ball, and then there's actually sphere. Look at the difference, and we'll explain this in a few. A sphere is, think of it like globe, longitudinal, latitudinal lines, meaning it has vertices, main vertices at the poles, and it has longitudinal lines around, latitudinal lines going up and down. A quad ball, however, is more like a box that has been inflated perfectly into a sphere. So you essentially kind of have it as faces on the edges, faces on top. It's just been inflated out to where it makes a sphere. That's the difference. Simpler ones, you have a plane, which is simply a infinite plane comprised of subdivisions of edges and vertices. Or you can create the simplest one, which is simply a single face that you can then make additional faces with. So you can make complex objects, simpler ones, however you want to start with things. And there's, of course, from the drop down, there's more. There's a toroid, a donut. You can also create pipe, which does, in fact, still work the same way as the pipe tool from the Ring project. You create with a sketch path, and you automatically create a pipe built around that. Only now you can modify that. Think of it in terms of like the difference between like a basic bicycle frame where it's just a drawing of like kind of like a rough triangle with just tubes, versus like a really fancy bicycle where the tubes and such are a bit more organically shaped, stuff like that. Kind of sort of the difference. That's not a great analogy, but that's the best thing I can think of at the moment. Instead of just straight tubes, you can modify them, make them a little more organic, that sort of thing. And again, you can still extrude. I'm going to show you how to do some of this stuff. You can still revolve a sketch, only it creates multiple faces and such like that. You can still create sweeps. You can still create lofts. You just have a lot more options to manipulate them. We're going to keep it simple, work from there. So first, let's just go through some basics here. Let's create a box. Just the same, select an object. You have to select a starting plane. Like we've done before, the XY plane, sure. Now this starts from a center rectangle. By default, you have a couple of options, either center rectangle or 2-point, which means either you start in the middle and it grows outward, or you start at 1 point and it builds it outward that way. Doesn't matter. We'll keep it right smack in the middle. You create how big you like it, just the same as before, creating a rectangle. How many millimeters by how many millimeters? I don't know, 50 by 120, whatever. Okay, direction one-sided. Hit enter. Oops, hit too many. There we go. Now, before you hit enter, if I just click outside, left click, now I have the option to also make it taller, and I can make more divisions of faces. Like I said, keep it simple for now, but to show you how you can create ones, you can either do it manually, grab one of the sliders. So I go up, you can see how much it subdivides everything. The more subdivisions, the finer the detail. However, we're going to be manipulating this, meaning that if you have to keep track of a whole bunch more faces or vertices or anything like that, there's just a lot more to deal with. So what that means is keep it simple for now. Maybe just minor subdivisions. If you want, same deal, add a lot, or keep it more simple. Same deal goes around. Now, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but you can also create with symmetry, on or off. You can turn it on now, and I'll describe how that works in a moment. But basically, how it gets visualized is by length. You see the green line that appears here? That means along its length, it will be mirrored side to side. By width, mirrored front to back. Or height, top to bottom. You can turn them all on if you want. You can also turn it off later. But for now, let's just turn those off and I'll show you how to apply it later. Why would you want to apply it later instead of now? Maybe you want to modify it a little bit first and then figure it out. Or you just want to make something a little more freeform. Say, okay, cool. All right, great. I have this kind of weird roundy box. What do I do with this? The main tool we're going to be using for this project and moving forward is under modify. It's the first default tool, edit form. And as you can see, it manipulates faces, edges, and vertices with transform, scale, and rotate editing. What that means is transform moves it around, scale obviously up and down, and rotate means you can move it in along any of the axes. You can select by faces, the whole thing, edges, just the lines, or by vertices, just the points. A lot of this is going to end up as preference or depending on what you're trying to achieve. So let's bring up that space, brings up a new toolbox. You've got a whole bunch of options. Default is you have all the options and everything. What that means is when I mouse over, you can see I can select either by face, by edge, by vertex. If I wanted to isolate those, you can see the selection filter here. The default is all the things. By face means I can only select the faces. By edges means I can only select the edge. If you double click an edge, it'll select the whole thing in the round. By vertex, you can see it brings up all the points and you can see them that way. Totally however you want to work. Depends on what you're doing. Some will make more sense than others. Your options are going to be all the things, meaning if I bring this up, if I select here, you can see all that in my toolbox or my gimbal here. My selection thing, it's kind of a little overwhelming and it doesn't get bigger with scale. It always stays the same size. But to give you a sense of reference here, the arrow keys, that drags it a single direction. forward and back, up and down. The squares allow you to move it freeform within that direction, because ultimately, one of the difficult things about this, you are trying to manipulate a three-dimensional object in virtual three-dimensional space with a two-dimensional input object, meaning your mouse. Your mouse can only roll around on the screen. Now, if you had like a virtual, if you had a virtual setup, yeah, you could totally like grab a thing and move it in multiple directions at once. This doesn't allow that. So you kind of get isolated with this. So if I grab one of the flat planes, now I can move it up and down and in and out. Same thing with the others. Now, obviously, if I move this, if this intersects itself, it's going to end up with problems later, but we'll deal with that. Drag it outward, do whatever. The lines on the outside are scale. The straight up and down or side to side lines is a single scale, meaning non-uniform scale. It only scales it in that dimension. Scale doesn't make sense in that one, but if I zoom it up, you can see how I can now scale it face up and down and such. The curve on the side, this is really kind of irritating because I'm only seeing it from that side. There we go. The curve part, that is a uniform scale across two dimensions. So if I scale it up and down, it's scaling it in the Y and Z dimension. Right in the center, you see when I mouse over, it makes it, those three little arrows appear. That is a full uniform scale. Getting too big to see anyway, so it doesn't really make sense. The last one is the orbit tools. And I mouse over these partial curves, the little dot there. You can see now how I can rotate it against the y-axis, the z or the x-axis, or the z-axis. So obviously, it's kind of limiting. It was a simple thing, but we can play with other stuff still. Now, we'll talk about soft modifications and all that stuff later. Right now, let's just stick with these kind of filters. And of course, you can select by body. Select that. Now I can truly uniform scale the whole thing in and out, or non-uniform rather. I scale it up like that, and you can see how it's more narrow and all that. Or all the things by scale. There you go. So that's going to be one of the main ways we play around with this. One of the other things you can do is if you're selecting by face and such, mainly specifically by face, you can extrude with this. So what that means is, instead of just moving in and out, I can actually, add extrusions to this. How I'm doing that is you press and hold the Alt key, and each time it will create a new division, and you can drag that outward. Because from there, you could then say like scale up or scale down, all that kind of thing. You could, of course, rotate any of these. This is how you really start manipulating these objects. Start playing around with that. There's, of course, more you can do, like what if I delete a face? Well, you can't do that right now. Finish the edit form. I can select like that whole face, delete it. That's going to do some weird stuff because you just removed one of the defining features. So right now, it just turned it into a big like tube thing. What if it's open-ended? Well, right now, it is basically only exists as a hollow surface. So think of it in terms of like a tube of paper. There's nothing there. There's no end cap. It's just the outside. Meaning like I could not print this as it is until I went and did something like modify and fill hole. It's pretty straightforward terminology. Select by the edges, and it drops it back down. There's, of course, different ways you can approach this. Right now, reduce star just does that. You can make it a sharp edge. There's a lot we can do with this, but let's try not to overwhelm with this. Yeah, basically, you can make all kinds of weirdness. All right. So, and just for reference, all right, so this oddball shape was a box. So that's what I mean by you can really freeform manipulate this stuff, but you're not going to get like super fine detail, things like that. But you can play around with a lot of these. So, all right, super duper, finish form. It brings it back to a solid object. Let's hide that, and I'll start a new form, and this time we'll say like a sphere. All right, same deal, smack in the middle. Let's make this, I don't know, 100 millimeters. All right, so again, let's try to simplify this. Let's bring that down to 6 faces, longitude and latitude. That'll make it simpler. Um, we'll say okay. Now, from this, I want to do some manipulating and show you how you can make use of like the symmetry. So yes, I could have applied symmetry right there, but I want to show you some of the other options. Basically, I want to explain symmetry here. Bring on that tool, or you can open this up and you can see some other stuff here. There are differences. In the form workspace, you can create multiples either within. So internal symmetry is subdividing an object and you have, left, right, front, back, up, down, or both, or all the things. There you go. Circular symmetry is great for rounded objects like a sphere. You also have duplicates and such. So you can make symmetrical objects and make a duplicate across the side. So this is great if you're trying to figure out like a mirrored object, stuff like that. You can also make circular duplicates, yada, yada. Basically, we're going to be keeping with the first two. And of course, you can also remove symmetry. And what that's great for is that, say I want to, in this internal symmetry, what you do, select by faces. If I select on this side, then that side, I'm going to get symmetry across here. But if I start selecting more, like by there, oops, cross, I'm going to get across, things like that. I can start adding more, all that. If I want to make modifications, things like that, and then I want them to be isolated later, I can turn off symmetry. So with something like that, all right, let's do like circular symmetry specifically. If I select like on a rounded object, if I select one face, it's going to give me options. What these are here, you can see if I select here, it's going to make 6 divisions. There, 3, there, 2. So you can see how it's subdivided into 3. Pretty neat options. And it's going to give you just some options in there in general. Like, all right, cool. So now for something like this, go to edit form. I can work with just one face. Or let's see here. Let's try to make this a little bit more straightforward. All right. So I can work along an axis. So this is really handy with stuff like this. Because if I selected that one, my axis lines don't line up with the major axis. Meaning if I went straight out, it's going to go left instead of like, so meaning like if I have it out, if I have a round thing, instead of it going straight out relative to the object, it's going to go straight out relative to the actual axis. So with this one, let's select that one instead. So the reason for this is now I can grab that. If I drag outward, it starts manipulating in all directions. Or if I press and hold Alt, that'll be the extrude. Now I can start subdividing it. Now let's say, I don't know, let's scale this upward. So it's really easy to get lost. Scale again or extrude again. Let's rotate it. All right. Press and hold Alt. I can also use the free transform and just kind of drag stuff outward. So I can really start doing some weird stuff with this. Now, of course, that's just the end. What if I then wanted to, I don't know, grab from up the sides or grab multiple sides? All right. Drag that outward or even extrude it outward, all that kind of thing. So you start making some really weird, I don't know, paddle thing. Well, now, let's say I wanted to hit OK, and now I wanted to modify those individually. Now that would be where you take the symmetry, clear symmetry for the object. OK. So now when I go back to edit form, if I grab one of these, it's no longer going to have an effect on anything. So this is great if you're like what the final project will be is you're going to be making using the edit tool, form tools and such, a plush animal. So maybe you make things with 3 or 4 or 20 legs, whatever, and then you want to modify each leg and kind of give it a different pose. That's why you would then clear symmetry and such. So yeah, you can really play around with this stuff. Same thing as if you want to start deleting faces, you start getting some weird stuff, or you wanted to chop all kinds of stuff out, all that sort. Why would you do that? I don't know. It's depending on what you're modeling. But you can start getting some really funky stuff with this. But that's pretty much with this. I highly recommend just play. We are going to get to some of the other objects, some of the other tools, but as you can see, if I hit the drop down for modify, there are a pile of different tools. Same with creating multiple different objects, multiple different ways of working. The best thing I can tell you to do, play. Experiment and play with the form workspace. It's the best way to just familiarize yourself with stuff. You're not going to hurt anything or anything like that. Just see what something does. Create an object, grab, press and pull some faces with the edit form tool, then start chopping stuff up. Things like you can use the crease tool here. That allows you to grab edges, and it makes those edges, instead of rounded, makes them sharp. So if I wanted to make, well, just that, sharp edges, great for that. One of the other tools is, say I wanted to make this more detailed. I can insert edge. So if right now I wanted more detail in the face, I can select edges and such, and then move that around. We will be using this later, but I can then hit OK. Now I have even more edges, more vertices to manipulate with. So you can subdivide faces, things like that. Speaking of, you can then also say, like, what if I wanted to make this whole thing actually hollow and I wanted to make it a thicker thing? So I wanted to give it dimension. There is a thicken tool. We're going to be using this shortly. So this is specifically for making like hollow objects. Select the thing, add a thickness, let's say 1 millimeter. Now, right now, it's showing me this weird box around it. That's just a rough, that's just showing me a more simplified visualization of what it'll look like thickened, because I'm working with it being rounded. It's showing this to me in more directional terms. So you have edges. You can either do it a sharp edge, round edge, or you could even do no edge if you really wanted to. We'll say sharp edge, see what happens. So now this object actually has a thickened edge. So now this technically could be printable as a hollow, albeit weird, but hollow solid object. You cannot print a hollow form that does not have dimension. If it only has the outermost edge surface, you cannot print it. It does not translate to the printers. But if it has thickness, if it actually has dimension, now you can. So play around with this. There's obviously all your other tools and all that kind of stuff. You can still play with inserting edge images and stuff like that if you wanted to model stuff based on things. The one other thing I wanted to show you is what will come up is, let's try to say finish form. What do you know? Errors, of course. Return. You have a couple of different options here. You have the repair body mode, which if I select that, it's going to give me a bunch of star points. These are problematic points. And this is just because it's hollow. If this were a solid object, this would go away entirely. But you can try auto repair. So what that did is it just shifted that around. Hit OK. Let's try finish form. And still errors. And this is just because this is a really complex shape here. Let's say return, or actually, let me show you what happens if I hit continue. All right, actually, it didn't even let me, it's not even going to let me do anything because it was a completely non-calculatable solid. So let's Control Z. Basically, what I could do is step back from the thicken thing. There we go. It's no longer a thickened object. Now it's back to just being a surface thing. Go to modify. Let's fill the hole. Double click that edge. Did some weird stuff there because it's trying to there. Because I left it on keep crease. There you go. Allow it to get rounded again. Let's try that. Or maybe we try some different. There we go. That looks more rounded. You can see it more easily. Go from there. Should be able to hit okay. But one of the things, if you're trying to identify what is wrong, the one other thing is this display mode. It's the other top one. It is not actually changing your object. It is simply showing it to you in a more simplified manner. If I select my object and go to box mode, now you can see the object as simple, more simplified geometry. This is usually a simpler way to see if you have accidentally made a thing that self-intersects. If it self-intersects, it will not be able to calculate the object. It'll cause errors. Often enough, the easiest way to fix stuff like that is just delete faces and then close them up like that. But it's just a different way of showing you. You have the combined option where you're getting both a view of the more geometric shape view, and you can see the rounded object inside of it. You can treat these as just control points, meaning if I go to edit form, and let's say by vertex, you can see I can grab like the vertices themselves, and you can just have a little bit more detail, or it's a little bit easier to understand what you're working on. That's pretty much it. All right, so a lot of overload there. My recommendation, play. We're going to play with these for a little bit, and then we'll do some actual demonstration. So last thing, let's hit finish form. Huzzah, no errors. You can save now. All right. So we'll save. Example, weird shape. There you go. I should have saved it right from the get-go. That is definitely going to be an important thing now, as it has been, but there are some really weird calculations that can happen, and it can definitely catch your computer and gum it up or freeze it. Save early, save often, and play. All right.